Pack your bags. Go back to your parents and don't even think about stepping foot in this house again until every single cent of your debt is gone." Those were the words my husband spat at me, his voice cold, eyes filled with a resentment I didn't know a human being could hold for the person they supposedly loved. It wasn't a heat-of-the-moment scream. It was a calculated, frozen command. In that moment, looking at the man I had married only 18 months ago, I realized I wasn't a partner to him anymore. I was a liability. I was a line item on a spreadsheet that wasn't adding up, and he was ready to delete me. But how did we get here? How does a marriage go from "I do" to "get out" in less than 2 years? It started with a promise, a simple, non-negotiable rule I had before I ever let him into my heart. And it ended with a revelation that made me wonder if I ever really knew the man sleeping next to me at all. Is it possible to build a future when both people feel like they've been sold a lie? I'm 29 years old, and if you had asked me 2 years ago where I'd be today, I would have told you I'd be finishing my master's, building a home, and maybe even thinking about names for a nursery. Instead, I'm sitting in a house that feels like a courtroom, defending my right to exist in my own marriage. To understand the explosion, you have to understand the fuse. And that fuse was lit long before we even walked down the aisle. When I met him, let's call him Omar, he seemed like everything I had been looking for. He was 31, driven, successful, and he had this calm energy about him that made me feel safe. We came from the same cultural background, which meant we shared the same values regarding family and tradition. But I had one major deal breaker. It might sound small to some, but to me it was everything. I told him clearly and repeatedly that I could never marry a smoker. No cigarettes, no weed, nothing. I've seen what it does to people's health, the way it clings to the walls, the clothes, the very soul of a home. I wanted a clean life. Omar didn't hesitate. He told me that he had experimented in his university days. Who hasn't, right? But that he had left that lifestyle far behind him. He said he lived a simple, healthy life now. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He looked the part. He smelled like expensive cologne and success. We spent our engagement talking about the future, our careers, and how we would blend our lives. I was transparent with him from the jump. I told him I was heading back to school for my master's program. I told him I'd be taking on about $50,000 in student loans to make it happen. I even told him the exact cost. My parents were there when we discussed it. They heard me say it, and they heard him say that he didn't want to be responsible for my debt. I agreed. I told him, "I'm going to work, and I'm going to pay this off myself. It's my investment in our future." He nodded. We moved forward. We were a team, or so I thought. The first crack in the foundation appeared on day 3 of our marriage. Not month 3, day 3. We were at the hotel, getting ready for our big wedding reception. The flowers were being delivered, the music was being tested, and I was sitting there in my bridal robes, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. That's when Omar sat me down. He looked pale, almost sick. He told me he had something to confess. He said he felt ashamed. He told me that he had been smoking the entire time we were dating, the entire time we were engaged, every time he went for a walk, every time he stayed late at work. He was lighting up. He told me he only stopped 4 days before the wedding because he didn't want to smell like it on the big day. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. It wasn't just about the smoke. It was the realization that our entire courtship was a performance. Every "I love you," every promise of honesty was layered over the smell of tobacco he had carefully washed off his skin before seeing me. I was devastated, but we were 3 days into a marriage. Our families were downstairs. What was I supposed to do? He apologized. He cried. He said he did it because he knew I wouldn't like it, and he didn't want to lose me. I chose to forgive him. I thought, this is our first test. We can get past this. But the forgiveness didn't last long, because the real Omar started to emerge. About 4 months into the marriage, the smell came back. It started as a faint hint on his jacket, then it was in his hair. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to hide it anymore. He got defensive. He told me he was stressed. And then, he did something that would become his favorite tactic. He turned it around on me. He said the reason he was smoking again was because of the financial stress I was putting on him. Your loans, he'd say, waving a hand dismissively as he exhaled a cloud of smoke I had specifically asked him never to bring into our lives. How am I supposed to relax when I know we have $50,000 hanging over our heads? I was stunned. Omar, we talked about this. You knew about the loans before we even got engaged. I'm working. I'm paying them. You haven't spent a single dime on my education. But that's when his logic started to warp into something unrecognizable. In our culture, the husband usually covers the household expenses, the mortgage, the bills, the groceries. The wife's income is traditionally hers to keep or contribute as she sees fit. Before we got married, he agreed to this. But now that we were actually living it, he had a new rule. He told me that if I was working, my money should be going toward the house. If you're using your paycheck to pay off your loans, he argued, then indirectly I'm the one paying for them, because if you didn't have those loans, that money would be going toward our mortgage. So really, you're stealing from our future to pay for your past. I tried to explain that once I finished my master's, my salary would double. I'd be making almost as much as him. I could pay the debt off in a few years and then we would be set for life. I was thinking long term. I was thinking about the big picture. But Omar? He was thinking about control. He started calling me selfish. Every time I bought a coffee or a new shirt, he'd look at me like I was committing a crime. Must be nice to only have to worry about yourself, he'd sneer. He started claiming that we couldn't start a family because of my debt. We couldn't travel. We couldn't move to a bigger house. He made my student loans the scapegoat for every single frustration in his life. He claimed I had misled him, that he assumed my father was going to pay for my school, or that I had some secret savings account I was hiding. I never said those things, not once. But he had created a version of me in his head, a version that was a liar, just so he could justify his own lies and his growing resentment. The atmosphere in our home shifted from a sanctuary to a war zone. I found myself walking on eggshells, checking the trash cans for cigarette butts, and checking my bank account to make sure I could justify every cent I spent. The man who had once made me feel safe now made me feel like an intruder in my own home. And the worst part? He started bringing my family into it. It's funny how a person can rewrite history right in front of your eyes. Omar started telling anyone who would listen, and especially me, every single night, that I had trapped him, that I had walked into this marriage under false pretenses. He'd sit across from me at the dinner table, the air between us thick with a tension you could practically touch, and he'd recount his version of our engagement as if he'd been blindfolded the whole time. "I thought your father was taking care of it," he'd say, his voice dripping with a kind of weary disappointment that hurt worse than a scream. I assumed a man of his standing wouldn't let his daughter start a marriage with a $50,000 weight around her neck. You let me believe that. You stayed silent while I planned a life I thought we could afford. But I hadn't been silent. I had the spreadsheets. I had the emails. I had the memory of sitting in my parents' living room, the tea cooling on the table, as I laid out exactly how much the master's program cost and how I intended to fund it. He was there. He had nodded. He had even said he was proud of my ambition. But now, that ambition was a weapon he was using against me. It was like he had amnesia for everything that didn't serve his anger. And then there was the smoking. It became the backdrop to every argument. I'd walk into the garage and the smell would hit me, that stale, acrid scent of betrayal. When I'd confront him, he wouldn't even apologize anymore. He'd just shrug and say, If you didn't stress me out so much with these loans, I wouldn't need to smoke. You're literally forcing me to do this to my body. Do you know what that does to your head? To be told that someone else's self-destructive habit is somehow your fault. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I began questioning my own memories. Did I tell him? Did I make it clear enough? I found myself digging through old text messages from 2 years ago, looking for proof that I wasn't the liar he said I was. I found a message where I specifically mentioned the loan disbursement date. I showed it to him, thinking that evidence would end the debate. He didn't even look at the screen. He just pushed my hand away and said, "One text message doesn't change the fact that you're being selfish now. You're working 40 hours a week, and for what? To pay back a bank, while I pay for the roof over your head and the food in your mouth. That's not a partnership. That's you using me as a benefactor so you can get a degree for free." That word, using, started to come up more and more. It was a poison that began to seep into every corner of our lives. In our culture, there's a beautiful tradition where a husband provides for the home so the wife can have security. It's meant to be an act of love and protection. But Omar turned it into a cage. He started viewing my education not as a step forward for our family, but as a personal insult to his bank account. He'd calculate the hours I spent studying and the hours I spent at my job, and then he'd compare them to the state of the house. If there were dishes in the sink, or if I hadn't had time to make a full traditional meal because I was finishing a paper, he'd explode. "You're not fulfilling your duties," he'd bark. "If you're not contributing financially to this household, the least you could do is make sure I'm taken care of. But no, you're too busy paying for your precious masters. So I'm paying for the house, I'm doing the heavy lifting, and I don't even get a hot meal when I come home? You're acting like a roommate who doesn't pay rent." I felt like I was drowning. I was working full-time, studying late into the night, and trying to be the perfect wife he demanded, all while being told I was a failure at all of it. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. I'd cry in the shower so he wouldn't hear me, letting the water wash away the salt of my tears, trying to figure out where the man I loved had gone. Was he ever really there? Or was that just another performance? Like the 4 days he spent not smoking before the wedding. The cycle was the most exhausting part. We'd have these massive, earth-shattering fights where he'd call me every name in the book. He'd call me a gold digger, a liar, a parasite. I'd stand there, shaking, trying to defend my character, trying to remind him that I loved him. And then, a few hours later, or maybe the next morning, the old Omar would return. He'd bring me coffee. He'd apologize. He'd say he was just stressed, that his family back home was putting pressure on him, that his past trauma from his parents' messy divorce made him sensitive about money. He'd hold me and promise he would do better. He'd promised to stop smoking. Again. And for a day, or maybe even a week, I'd breathe. I'd think, okay, we're back. We can fix this. He's hurting, and I just need to be more patient. But the reset never lasted. The issues were never actually resolved. They were just buried under a thin layer of temporary peace. And every time they resurfaced, they were uglier. The turning point, the moment the floor truly fell out from under me, happened about a month ago. It started with a phone call. My parents had called to check in, just a normal Sunday afternoon chat. They mentioned how excited they were for my graduation next year. They were so proud of me. But after I hung up, I realized Omar had been standing in the doorway, listening. His face was contorted in a way I'd never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was pure, unadulterated loathing. "They're real proud, aren't they?" he hissed. "Proud that they managed to pawn you off on a guy who's willing to foot the bill for your life while you play student. Did you guys sit around and plan this? Was this the big family scheme? Get her married to someone with a good income so we don't have to pay for her loans?" I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Omar, stop. Do not talk about my parents like that. They have nothing to do with this. They've been nothing but supportive of us. Supportive? He laughed, a harsh, dry sound. They're con artists. They raised a daughter who knows exactly how to manipulate a man into paying her way. You're all the same, you and your parents. You're just users. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. You can say a lot of things to me. You can call me names, you can criticize my cooking, you can even lie to me about your habits. But the second you go after the people who raised me with integrity, the people who actually did tell the truth, that's where the line is drawn. Don't you dare, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. My parents are the reason I have the values I do. They're the reason I'm working my way through this instead of asking you for a single penny. If anyone is a liar in this room, Omar, look in the mirror. Look at the cigarettes hidden in your car. Look at the promises you made me about the kind of man you were. That was it. That was the spark that set the whole house on fire. He didn't just yell this time. He went for the jugular. He started pacing, throwing his hands in the air, his voice rising until it was vibrating through the walls. He accused me of being a financial burden that was stopping him from having a real life. He told me that every time he looked at me, all he saw was a debt. Not a wife, a debt. And then came the ultimatum, the words that changed everything. He told me that he was done being used. He told me that our marriage was on pause until I was no longer a liability. I'm not joking, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. I want you out. Today. Go back to your parents' house. Let them see the ambitious daughter they're so proud of. And don't you dare come back until that loan balance is zero. If you want to be an independent woman who pays for her own things, go do it somewhere else. Because as far as I'm concerned, I didn't marry a partner. I married a scam. I stood there in the middle of our living room, the room where we had picked out the rug together, where we had watched movies, where I thought we were building a life. And I realized I was looking at a stranger who wanted to punish me for a future I was trying to build for both of us. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay on the edge of the guest bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through a million different scenarios, none of them ending well. The house was dead silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the temperature dropped. In the master bedroom, just down the hall, my husband was fast asleep. I could hear his even breathing. How could he sleep? How could a man who had just dismantled our marriage, insulted my parents, and ordered me out of my own home simply turn off the lights and drift away? It felt like a physical blow. It was the ultimate dismissal of my existence in his life. I spent those dark hours mentally packing my bags. I imagined folding my clothes, taking down my framed photos, unmaking the life we had started to weave together. And with every imaginary item I packed, the grief hit harder. I wasn't just grieving a house, I was grieving the man I thought I had married. The man who had looked at me across a crowded restaurant on our third date and said, I've never met anyone as driven as you. It makes me want to be better. Where was that man? The next morning, the sun came up like it always does, indifferent to the fact that my world had stopped spinning. I heard Omar moving around the kitchen. I heard the clink of a coffee mug, the slam of the refrigerator door. I walked out of the guest room, bracing myself for another argument, another wave of accusations. But when I walked into the kitchen, he didn't look angry. He looked hollow. He was leaning against the counter, staring into his coffee, and when he looked up at me, there was a shift in his eyes. It was the reset. I could practically see the gears turning in his head as he realized how far he had gone the night before. I'm sorry, he mumbled, barely making eye contact. I was stressed. You know how I get when I'm stressed about money. It's my family. My dad used to fight with my mum about money all the time, and I don't want to be them. But I overreacted. I didn't mean it. You don't have to leave. It was the same script, the same apology, the same invocation of his past trauma to excuse his present cruelty. A month ago, a week ago, maybe even a day ago, I would have accepted it. I would have wrapped my arms around him, told him we were a team, and promised that things would get easier once I graduated. I would have swallowed my pride, pushed down the hurt of him calling my parents con artists, and tried to play the role of the understanding, patient wife. But something in me had broken the night before. "You told me to leave until my loans were paid off, Omar," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You called me a scam. You insulted my parents. You can't just say, 'I'm stressed,' and expect that to disappear. Words mean things. You can't unsay them." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, exasperated that I wasn't just hitting the reset button with him. I said I was sorry. What else do you want me to do? Beg? I'm the one paying for everything here. I'm the one carrying the weight of this household while you go to school. Can't you have a little empathy for how hard that is for me? There it was, the immediate pivot back to his victimhood. It didn't matter what he had done. He was always the one suffering the most. He was the martyr of our marriage, and I was the ungrateful burden. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just turned around and walked back to the guest room. For the first time in our relationship, I realized that I couldn't fix this with logic. I couldn't fix it by working harder, by being quieter, by being more accommodating. His resentment wasn't about the $50,000. It was about control. It was about the fact that my loans represented a part of my life that he didn't own, a part of my future that I was building independently of him. Once I graduated, once I was making as much money as him, he would lose his leverage. He would lose the ability to hold his financial contributions over my head like a crown. And that terrified him. The next few weeks were a masterclass in emotional whiplash. We existed in a state of suspended animation. We'd go days barely speaking, communicating only about groceries or utility bills. Then, out of nowhere, he'd buy me flowers. He'd suggest we go out to dinner. He'd act like the man I fell in love with, charming and attentive, completely ignoring the massive elephant standing between us. But the tension never really left. It was always there, humming in the background like a faulty wire, just waiting for a spark. I found myself shrinking. I stopped talking about my classes. I stopped mentioning my graduation plans. When my parents called, I'd take the call in my car or wait until he was out of the house, terrified that the mere sound of their voices would trigger another explosive rant about how they were using him. I was living a double life. At work and at school, I was capable, driven, and respected. At home, I was a nuisance, a debt, a liar. And the smoking, it became flagrant. He stopped trying to hide it. I'd come home from an exhausting shift at work, followed by a 3-hour lecture, and find him on the back patio, a cigarette dangling from his lips, a cloud of smoke surrounding him like a shield. "Rough day?" he'd ask, taking a drag, his eyes daring me to comment. "Yeah," I'd say, walking past him, the smell making me nauseous. "Long day." "Well, you chose this," he'd reply, blowing the smoke into the evening air. "You chose the debt. You chose the stress. Don't expect me to pity you." It was death by 1,000 cuts. Every comment, every cigarette, every side apology that meant absolutely nothing. I started to feel a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. It wasn't just physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of constantly defending my reality against someone who was determined to rewrite it. I started going to therapy on my own. I couldn't afford much, but my university offered discounted sessions for students. I sat in a small, fluorescent-lit office with a counsellor and poured out 18 months of confusion, gaslighting, and heartbreak. I told her about the smoking. I told her about the loans. I told her about his reaction to my parents. She listened quietly, taking notes, her face a mask of professional empathy. When I finally finished, out of breath and fighting back tears, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. "If a friend came to you and told you this exact same story," she said gently, "what would you tell her to do?" I stared at her. The answer was immediate. It was obvious. I tell her to run. I tell her that a man who lies about who he is to get you down the aisle, who punishes you for trying to better yourself, and who uses his money as a weapon to control you, is not a man who loves you. He loves the power he has over you. But it's so much harder when it's your own life. It's so much harder when you remember the good days, when you remember the way he held you when your grandmother passed away, or the way he used to make you laugh until your sides ached. It's terrifying to look at the wreckage of a marriage that isn't even 2 years old and admit that you failed, that you chose wrong, that the forever you promised in front of all your friends and family was a mistake. I left that therapy session with a heavy heart, but also with a sudden, sharp clarity. The cycle wasn't going to break itself. The apologies were just a tool to keep me compliant until the next explosion. I had to make a choice. I was standing at a crossroads, and both paths looked agonizingly painful. The first path was the one he had laid out for me that terrible night. Leave. Get a divorce. Pack whatever I could fit into my old sedan, drive back to my parents' house, and admit defeat. It meant walking into the house I grew up in, looking at the two people who loved me more than anything, and telling them that the man they trusted to take care of me had called them con artists. It meant starting over at 29, carrying the weight of a failed marriage alongside the $50,000 in student loans I was already stressed about. It meant the whispers in our community, the sympathetic looks from aunts and cousins, the inevitable questions. "What happened? Didn't you just get married?" But it also meant breathing again. It meant coming home to a house that didn't smell like deceit and stale tobacco. It meant studying without someone calculating the cost of my time. It meant freedom. The second path was the one my heart, or at least the part of my heart that still clung to the man I thought I married, wanted to try. Couples therapy. It meant dragging this broken, bleeding relationship into a neutral space and forcing him to look at the damage he was doing. It meant confronting the trauma he constantly used as a shield. It meant saying, "I see you're hurting from your past, but you cannot use that hurt to destroy our present." But the thought of sitting in a room with him, listening to him explain to a therapist how my ambition was actually a character flaw, how my parents were manipulators, and how his smoking was my fault, it made my stomach turn. What if he just used the therapy sessions to refine his arguments? What if he convinced the therapist that I really was the selfish, ungrateful wife he painted me to be? What if we spent thousands of dollars we didn't have, only to end up exactly where we started, just with more sophisticated vocabulary for our fights? I was paralyzed. Every day felt like I was walking a tightrope, trying not to look down at the drop below. I tried to bring up therapy one evening, about a week after my own session. We had just finished dinner, a silent, tense affair, where the only sound was the scraping of forks against plates. He had retreated to the living room, flipping aimlessly through channels on the TV, the faint smell of smoke clinging to his sweater from his quick trip to the store. I sat down on the edge of the sofa, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird. "Omar," I started, my voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk." He didn't look away from the screen. "I'm not fighting tonight. I'm tired." "I'm not trying to fight," I said softly. "I'm trying to save us. I think we need help. We can't keep doing this. The fighting, the apologizing, the resenting each other. We're stuck in a loop and it's destroying us. We need to see a couples counselor." He finally muted the TV and slowly turned his head to look at me. His expression was a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Therapy?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "You want to pay some stranger $200 an hour to tell us what I already know?" And what is that? I asked, bracing myself. That if you just focused on this house instead of your loans, we wouldn't have any problems, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You don't need a therapist to tell you how to be a wife. You just need to step up and actually be one. You want me to sit in a room and have someone analyze my childhood trauma just so you don't have to admit you lied about your finances? No thanks. I'm not paying for someone to validate your selfishness. The finality in his tone was like a physical blow. He wasn't just rejecting the idea of therapy. He was rejecting the reality that he played any part in our misery. In his mind, he was perfect. He was the provider, the victim, the martyr. And I was the sole architect of our unhappiness. I didn't lie about my finances, Omar, I whispered, the fight draining out of me. I told you everything. You knew exactly what you were walking into. You omitted the part where paying them off would become your entire personality and my entire problem. He shot back, his eyes flashing with sudden anger. You want therapy? Go by yourself. Figure out why you're so incapable of putting your marriage first. But don't expect me to sit there and be the bad guy while you play the victim. He turned the volume back up on the TV, ending the conversation. I sat there for a long time, the canned laughter from some sitcom washing over me, feeling more alone than I ever had in my entire life. That was the answer, wasn't it? The second path, the hope for change, the desire to work through it, required two people willing to put in the work. It required two people willing to look at their own flaws and say, I want to be better for you. He wasn't willing. He was perfectly content in the dynamic he had created, as long as he was the one in control. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions of my life like a ghost haunting my own marriage. I went to work, I went to class, I smiled at my classmates, I nodded at my professors, I submitted my assignments on time. I even managed to cook dinners and keep the house reasonably tidy, a silent, desperate attempt to avoid giving him any ammunition. But inside, I was suffocating. The breaking point, the final, undeniable sign that there was no saving this, didn't come in the form of a screaming match or a thrown plate. It came in a quiet moment of absolute, chilling realization. It was a Saturday morning. He was out running errands, or so he said. I was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks and highlighters, trying to focus on a paper that was due the following week. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mum. Just checking in, sweetheart. Dad and I are thinking about you. We're so proud of how hard you're working. Can't wait to celebrate your graduation. Love you. I read the text, and a tear slipped down my cheek, splashing onto my notes. I missed them so much. I missed the safety of their home, the unconditional love they offered. I missed feeling like I was enough just as I was. As I wiped my face, I heard the front door open. Omar walked in, carrying a plastic bag. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how my studying was going. He just walked into the kitchen, dropped the bag on the counter, and sighed heavily. What a mess, he muttered, looking at the textbook spread across the table. I'm studying, I said quietly, not looking up. Right, he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. Always studying. Never any time for anything else. He opened the plastic bag and pulled out a carton of cigarettes. He didn't even try to hide it anymore. He tossed it onto the counter, right next to the fruit bowl, as casually as if it were a loaf of bread. I stared at the carton. The bright, garish packaging seemed to mock me. It was a physical manifestation of his complete disregard for my boundaries, my feelings, my entire existence in this marriage. Omar, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Please don't leave those there. He stopped, his hand resting on the carton, and looked at me. His eyes were cold, devoid of any warmth or affection. It's my house, he said slowly, emphasizing each word. I pay the mortgage. I pay the bills. I'll put my things wherever I damn well please. And if you don't like it, you know where the door is. He picked up the carton, turned his back to me, and walked out to the patio. A moment later, I heard the familiar flick of his lighter. I sat there, listening to the silence of the house, broken only by the sound of his exhales. And in that moment, the fog that had been clouding my judgment for 18 months suddenly cleared. He didn't love me. Not really. He loved the idea of a wife who was completely dependent on him, a wife who existed solely to cater to his needs and massage his ego. He resented my ambition because it threatened his control. He resented my parents because they represented a support system he couldn't manipulate. And he used my loans as an excuse to punish me for daring to want a life outside of his shadow. The lies, the gaslighting, the emotional abuse. It wasn't going to stop. It was never going to stop. I closed my textbook. I neatly stacked my notes. I stood up from the table, walked into the bedroom, and pulled my suitcase from the top of the closet. The sound of the zipper on my suitcase felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. It was the sound of finality, of a decision made after months of agonizing indecision. I moved through the bedroom with a robotic efficiency, grabbing my clothes, my toiletries, the few books that actually belonged to me. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was completely numb. I heard the slide of the patio door opening and closing, the heavy, measured footsteps of my husband moving through the kitchen. The familiar scent of tobacco smoke drifted down the hallway, preceding him like a dark cloud. He stopped in the doorway of the bedroom. I didn't turn around. I kept folding my sweaters, placing them neatly in the suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry, not yet. It was laced with a strange kind of amusement, as if he were watching a child throw a tantrum. "I'm packing," I said evenly, not breaking my rhythm. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You're packing? Really? Over a pack of cigarettes on the counter? Don't you think you're being a little dramatic?" I finally stopped and turned to face him. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked so sure of himself, so confident that this was just another performance, another empty threat that would end with me apologizing and unpacking my bags. "It's not about the cigarettes, Omar," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was beginning to pound against my ribs. "It's about what they represent. It's about the fact that you lied to me for months before we got married. It's about the fact that you use my ambition against me. It's about the fact that you insult my parents, you call me names, and you make me feel like I'm a burden in my own home." The smirk vanished. His expression hardened into a familiar mask of contempt. "Oh, here we go again. The victim act. I'm the bad guy because I ask you to contribute to the household instead of throwing all your money into a black hole of debt." "You knew about the debt!" I practically shouted, the numbness finally cracking, giving way to the exhaustion and fury I'd been suppressing for 18 months. "You knew exactly what you were signing up for. I didn't trick you, Omar. I didn't lie. You did. You lied about who you were, and now you're punishing me because I'm not the silent, subservient wife you actually wanted." He uncrossed his arms and took a step into the room, his physical presence suddenly overwhelming. "You want to talk about lying? You led me to believe you were an independent woman. An independent woman doesn't saddle her husband with her financial mistakes while she plays house. You're a leech, just like your family." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd heard them a dozen times before. But this time, they didn't crush me. They galvanized me. "My family," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "taught me to value honesty and hard work. They taught me to respect my partner, something you clearly know nothing about." I zipped up the first suitcase and hauled it off the bed. I grabbed my purse and my laptop bag. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, his voice rising, the realization finally dawning on him that I wasn't bluffing. "You think you can just walk out of here after everything I've done for you? After everything I've paid for?" "Yes," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I think I can. You told me to leave until my loans were paid off, remember? Well, I'm taking your advice. but I'm not coming back. For a second, just a split second, I saw panic flash in his eyes. It was quickly replaced by rage, a dark, ugly fury that distorted his features. He grabbed my arm as I tried to walk past him. His grip was tight, painful. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled, his face inches from mine, his breath rancid with smoke and anger. "You don't get to just quit when things get hard. You're my wife." I stared back at him, forcing myself not to flinch. "Let go of me, Omar." He held on for a beat longer, his chest heaving, his eyes burning into mine. Then he shoved my arm away in disgust. "Fine," he spat. "Go, run back to Mummy and Daddy. Let them deal with your mess. See how long they put up with your selfish bullshit. But don't expect me to come crawling back when you realize what you threw away." "I wouldn't dream of it," I said quietly. I walked down the hallway, the wheels of my suitcase clattering against the hardwood floor. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to take a last look at the living room we'd decorated, or the kitchen where we'd cooked our first meals as a married couple. I just kept walking until I was out the front door, into the cool afternoon air. The drive to my parents' house was a blur. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The radio turned off, the silence in the car ringing in my ears. I kept waiting for the tears to come, for the overwhelming wave of grief to wash over me. But it didn't. Instead, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of lightness. The crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest for a year and a half was gone. I could breathe. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the reality of what I had just done finally hit me. I was 29 years old, moving back into my childhood bedroom, carrying a broken marriage and $50,000 in debt. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a long time, staring at the front door. How was I supposed to tell them? How was I supposed to explain that the man they had trusted, the man they had welcomed into our family, had treated me like a disposable burden? The front door opened before I could even gather the courage to get out of the car. My mum stepped out onto the porch, a dish towel in her hands, a confused smile on her face. Then she saw my car. She saw the suitcases in the back seat. Her smile vanished. She walked quickly down the driveway, her face pale. My dad appeared in the doorway a second later, his brow furrowed in concern. I opened the car door and stepped out, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't say a word. I just looked at my mum, the dam finally breaking. The tears I'd been holding back for months flooded my vision. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She just wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into a fierce, protective embrace. My dad hurried down the driveway and joined us, wrapping his arms around both of us. "It's okay, sweetheart," my mum whispered into my hair, her voice trembling slightly. "You're home. It's going to be okay." I broke down. I sobbed into my mother's shoulder, the sound tearing out of me, jagged and ugly. I cried for the marriage I thought I was going to have. I cried for the man I thought I had married. I cried for the months of anxiety, the gaslighting, the sheer exhaustion of trying to be enough for someone who was determined to find me lacking. They brought me inside, sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had done my homework as a teenager, the same table where I had excitedly told them about my acceptance into the master's program. My dad made tea. My mum sat next to me, holding my hand, her eyes filled with a fierce, quiet anger as I finally told them everything. I told them about the smoking. I told them about the arguments over the loans. I told them about the names he called me, the insults he hurled at them. I told them about the ultimatum. When I finished, the kitchen was silent. My dad was staring down at his mug of tea, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. My mum squeezed my hand, her voice steady and resolute. "You are not going back," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "He doesn't deserve you. He never did. He called you con artists." I choked out, a fresh wave of shame washing over me. He said you raised me to use him. My dad finally looked up, his eyes hard, but soft when they met mine. His words reflect him, not us, he said quietly. A man who attacks his wife's family to make himself feel powerful is a coward. You did the right thing by leaving. We will get through this. You will finish your degree, you will pay off those loans, and you will build a life that you are proud of. Without him, their unwavering support was the anchor I needed. In the days that followed, the reality of the separation settled in. The logistical nightmare of untangling a marriage began. I contacted a lawyer. I transferred my share of the joint savings into a private account. I changed my passwords. I blocked his number, communicating only through my attorney. He didn't make it easy. True to form, he alternated between explosive anger and manipulative apologies. He'd send emails through his lawyer demanding the return of gifts he'd given me. Then he'd try to contact my friends, playing the heartbroken victim, claiming I had abandoned him over a simple misunderstanding about finances. But the fog had cleared. I saw his actions for what they were, desperate attempts to regain control. I didn't engage. I leaned on my parents, my friends, and my therapist. I poured all my energy into my studies, using the anger and the grief as fuel. It hasn't been easy. There are still days when the shame creeps in, when the whispers of failure try to pull me under. There are days when I miss the man I thought he was, the illusion he created during our engagement. But then I remember the smell of stale smoke. I remember the coldness in his eyes when he told me I was a burden, and the resolve hardens again. I am 29. I am living with my parents. I have $50,000 in student loan debt. But for the first time in a year and a half, I am free. I am no longer shrinking myself to fit into a life built on conditions and control. I am building a future on my own terms. And as for him, he's alone in that house, with his cigarettes and his resentment, desperately trying to find someone else to blame for the emptiness of his own life. I know the road ahead is long. Rebuilding a life from scratch takes time, patience, and a whole lot of grace. But I also know this. I would rather carry the weight of my loans than the weight of a man who makes me feel worthless. What about you? What would you have done if you found out your partner had been lying to you from the very beginning, and then used your ambition as a weapon against you? Would you have stayed and tried to fix it through therapy? Or would you have packed your bags like I did? Let me know in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your thoughts, and if any of you have navigated something similar. If you found my story relatable, or if you just want to support this channel, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world to me, and it helps bring more stories like this to light. Thank you for listening.